Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. The Economist has dubbed it the shaming of South Africa, a week of rioting which has claimed 330 lives and destroyed an estimated 40,000 businesses. The unrest follows the jailing of former President Jacob Zuma for contempt of court. But many say the reasons go much deeper, reflecting a country that has failed to build on the dreams of its first post-apartheid president, Nelson Mandela, and one could also say the dreams of its people. In a moment, with us here to reflect upon those events, we will have one of South Africa's best-known politicians, Helen Zille. Helen is the former leader of the Democratic Alliance, the main opposition party, and is now chairperson of the party's Federal Council. We'll come to Helen in just a moment, but we also have with us our expert based in South Africa, and that's Peter Sullivan. Peter was the editor of the Star newspaper, South Africa's leading broadsheet. Thank you very much for being here with us, Peter. Just to give us an overview for those who have been perhaps unaware of the news over the past few weeks, what has been happening?
That's a very good question. I wish I could give you a lovely definitive answer. But in fact, I was playing poker the other night with about 7 people, each of whom explained exactly what had been happening, and each of whom didn't actually know what was going on.
Okay, but just in terms of the actual facts on the ground, just in terms of what's been playing out on the streets and in townships and in shopping malls, what have you seen?
I think there are a couple of facts that are obvious. The one is that there was a build-up to do this once the Constitutional Court had decided to jail the former president, Jacob Zuma, for failing to appear in front of a commission he had set up and whose head he had appointed himself. And when he did so, had implored everybody to please listen to the commission and appear before it. But then he was sent to jail, and then there were dark forces moving. That's the first fact. The second fact is the looting and the disruption were caused by people with a deliberate intent to cause as much disruption as possible. An insurrection, really, in that they targeted the ports, they targeted the main line between Johannesburg and Durban, through which virtually all the goods flows that comes to Johannesburg. They targeted the railways, and those people we haven't yet found.
When you say we, I mean, you're sounding like you're part of the government himself, Peter. I mean, along with Cyril Ramaphosa has been saying things like this. But you're saying that there's a consensus of opinion that essentially that the violence that we have seen in in many ways was organized.
There is a definite consensus that violence was organized. But once the violence was organized, and organized in a very clever way, so they would target your local mall, for instance, and they would say, right, we are going to go to that mall, and a group of them armed with the kind of things that you need to break into a mall, go to the mall, but they would then send a whole lot of messages to people to say, the mall is open and free for goods, come and help yourselves. They targeted the main road between Johannesburg and Durban, and they burnt trucks, lots and lots of trucks, and they forced truck drivers to go across the road, to park their trucks, the huge big Pantechnicon, so that nobody could get past. In the recent history, a couple of trucks have been burnt because they were being driven by foreigners, and the local truck drivers union said foreigners should not be employed to drive our trucks, and they were hauled out of their trucks and they were hurt and their trucks were burnt. But this was completely different. This was an attempt to block the road, which they did very successfully. The problem with that is that we don't know who those people are. And everybody keeps giving us dark messages about they know who they are, in which case the general public keeps sort of saying, well, why don't you arrest them? If you know who's caused this disruption, it would be the first thing that anybody would do. We also know that the police were complicit in allowing things to happen in KwaZulu-Natal. To some extent, KwaZulu-Natal is a little bit different from the rest of the country, in the same way as the Western Cape is a little bit different from the country, a little bit like you would say that Scotland is different from England. And in KwaZulu-Natal, there was a feeling that their leader had been jailed. And the police, to some extent, were complicit, and they were part of that. But when the general mayhem arrived, I think the sort of third major fact is that people in all sorts of places stood up to the mob and got together and stopped the mob from doing what it was doing. And that has been a wonderful thing. I mean, most South Africans are, to some extent, quite delighted at how we all stood up to the mobs, generally across the country.
Yeah, and that's across all communities, whether it's black, Indian, white, you're across the board, you're saying.
Exactly, except for some areas, like there's a place called Phoenix in Durban, where the Indian guys decided to keep all black people out, but half the people in the suburb are black anyway, or African black. So there was a bit of fighting on that border, as it were. And 300 people have died, so it's not funny. But generally, I would say 5% of the country was in revolt, right, at the most. Right. And all of it was really in KwaZulu-Natal, tiny little bit, 95% in KwaZulu-Natal, 5% in Johannesburg, and nowhere else. And these people were hoping to create an insurrection, we believe, and cripple the country and force Ramaphosa to release Zuma and possibly to have an election and to get Ramaphosa out and their guys in.
Back in. Okay, let's just go back a step and just remind ourselves. Jacob Zuma, how long has Cyril Ramaphosa been in office for? And then the charges and the commission of inquiry into the corruption allegations surrounding Jacob Zuma. I just want to sort of recap on the charges against Jacob Zuma.
Well, that could take me a long time because he's managed to keep those charges at bay for 15 years, right? With the so-called Stalingrad defense, where he just keeps coming to court with a different objection all the time. So those charges relate from really when democracy came to South Africa and everybody got the vote in 1994, and the new government decided to spend billions on the arms deal, as it's called, which were new helicopters, new submarines, new fighter jets, all sorts of things that the country didn't need.
That's the arms corps deal, and those charges go back to 1999, don't they? And then since that, during his time in government, there are also other allegations and filings made against him.
There are a raft of allegations, but they really stem from the arms deal, right? And during that time, he was given money by Shabir Sheikh, and Sheikh gave him, and Sheikh eventually went to jail for it, but Zuma was not, and then those charges were reinstated against him. And then the public protector said that he should have an inquiry. And Jacob Zuma, before he left office, which was 2.5 years ago, he constituted the Zondo Commission, as it's called, into corruption and state capture. And the general consensus is that Zuma himself wasn't responsible for the state capture. What he was responsible for was allowing the 3 Gupta brothers to do the state capture and to capture the state in all sorts of nefarious ways. Generally, people think that probably Jacob Zuma doesn't have a great deal of money stashed away in Switzerland, but the 3 Zuma brothers have a lot of money stashed away in Dubai. But he then refused to appear before that commission. That went to the Constitutional Court, and they decided he needs to be jailed for 15 months. And that gave the bad guys, let's call them, the excuse to start the insurrection.
But Zuma did actually, he has been arrested, was put in jail. And then how long, what were the timeline of events between him being jailed and the protests taking place?
Oh, virtually immediate. So he was jailed, I can't quite remember, frankly. I think he was jailed on the Friday, and I think he was jailed on the Wednesday. And that very first weekend is when the insurrection took place. But there was a week of buildup where everybody was saying, there is going to be trouble, right? Yeah. And a whole lot of people gathered outside his house in Nkandla. And the minister responsible for state security, who a lot of people have been saying that she is actually on Zuma's side. And she, of course, gave no hint to the president of the trouble that was awaiting. She now claims that she did. And the presidency claims it didn't get any report from her. And the Minister of Police says he didn't get a report from her. And she says she gave him a report on the likely insurrection. So while all that happens at government level, people at the bottom are kind of saying, a lot of people have been arrested, but they've mainly been looters. Nobody's been arrested as the instigator of this whole trouble.
Okay. As we speak, we're trying to get Helen online, who's got some computer problems. And I'm just talking to my colleague, Dave Roberts, here online, and we're going to send her, I hope, a link as an attendee, which we can forward to her assistant, and then we'll promote her to being a panelist. And Dave, I've just sent you the number for the assistant, and hopefully if you give her the link, that she can pass that on to Helen. Fingers crossed she'll be with us very, very shortly. Peter, my first question to Helen really is going to be, I mean, how damaging do we think this is politically to the ANC? That's one of the questions, but also the economic damage seems to have been profound. But just dealing in terms of what's your assessment in terms of the economic impact? I mean, we've seen unrest in South Africa, come up, bubble away. There's, you do get street protests, you do get sort of unrest sometimes in the townships, but nothing on this scale.
Yeah, it's extraordinarily disruptive. The cost is very difficult to define. 50 billion rand, perhaps, not quite sure. The rand has recovered very well against the dollar, despite all of this. I'm not an economist. I mean, I can't tell you on the one hand and on the other hand, but I can tell you politically, on the one hand, it's very damaging to the ANC. On the other hand, it should strengthen Ramaphosa's hand to clean out the really stinking halls of corruption and his own cabinet. So within his own cabinet, because he has been a person who wanted to unite the ANC, that's what his entire sort of raison d'etre has been since he became president.
Yeah.
And it's now kind of time for him to clean out some of the people that he couldn't have done before. And we're all waiting on tenterhooks for what we hope is a cabinet reshuffle coming this week.
On the far left of the party, I mean, I guess there's two different directions. I mean, the question one could ask is, could you see a split within the ANC?
Definitely. So I think there is a split, and at one stage that split looked like it would run down the middle of the ANC, and you weren't quite sure who was going to have control, and that's why Cyril has been trying to keep everybody together. But now that Ace is out and Zuma is out, and a whole lot of people have kind of declared allegiance with them, known as the bad guys collectively, he may be able to clean out the stables. Whether he will or not, nobody knows. Whether he's going to continue to believe that the ANC should try to stay united, which I mean really would be the wrong thing, we don't know. And who am I to tell him how to run the country?
The rot surely precedes Jacob Zuma, doesn't it? I mean, in terms of, there was after the end of apartheid, there are these huge expectations, and you could argue that some progress was being made in terms of delivering economic change. Here we have, I think, yes, Helen, hello.
At last.
There we go. Thank you very much for joining us.
What a disaster.
South Africa or Zoom?
Pardon?
South Africa or Zoom?
Well, I don't know what it is. I really don't know what it is. I've never had problems with Zoom before, but it was really, we were battling at every level. I'm sorry, Pete, to do this to you. I really am.
Right. No, he's done very well. He's answered all the questions on your party's behalf.
Oh, good. So I've kept you waiting for 15 minutes, but believe me, I've been trying for 17 minutes to get on. I'm really very sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. So we've actually just been talking about what has been happening in terms of the actual unrest itself, and we've been talking a bit about Ramaphosa and the ANC. But I think my first question to you really is how damaging, we'll come to the politics in a second, how much damage has been done in terms of the impact on the economy and ordinary people's lives as well?
Well, it's been an enormous impact, of course. First of all, many, many businesses have been destroyed. And that on its own means a loss of huge amounts of capital. Plus, lots of people have lost jobs, and that is the worst part about it. The conservative estimates say 80 billion rand. The less conservative estimates say 160 billion rand is the cost. And perhaps the worst of all is that South Africa becomes an uninvestable destination, because together with expropriation without compensation, together with these riots, together with the labor unrest, together with the rules on BBBEE and various other things, it's creates large numbers of barriers to investment. This is the big worry.
That's you're talking about black economic empowerment, which
Yes.
prioritize black investment and black employments within the economy. Cyril Ramaphosa is suggesting that this unrest was organized. Do you agree with him?
I do think that the spark was Jacob Zuma's jailing. And I do think there were some people who were trying to incite violence as a consequence. But I do not believe that it was an organized insurrection. I think there was quite a bit of incitement going on, but the extent to which the looting took hold speaks to many other things. Some people were just opportunistic. I think large numbers of people were actually hungry and wanted, after months and months of lockdown, wanted access to resources and food and other things. So I think there was some incitement, quite a bit in fact. Social media helped enormously, as it always does in these movements. And as a consequence, the thing just set fire. And once the chain of events was in progress, it just ran on.
And how, I mean, I guess it's difficult to give us a broad answer, but how do people feel now? I mean, how are South Africans across different communities feeling about what's happened in terms of what it's done, both in terms of the impact upon their lives? But I mean, I was reading the headline in The Economist, the shaming of South Africa.
Well, South Africans react differently. For some, it means that radical economic transformation is now more real than it was before. And people feel that these sorts of insurrections are the way to go. That's some people, a limited number of people. I think for the majority in the ANC, the shaming of South Africa is the right phrase. I think they are extremely embarrassed by it. I think that was exemplified by the extent of the conflict between the Minister of State Security, Ayanda Dlodlo, and the Minister of Police, Becky Cele, both accused of not doing their jobs, both accusing the other of not doing their part of the job. So Becky Cele is saying to Ayanda Dlodlo, we didn't get any intelligence from you that this was about to happen. Ayanda Dlodlo saying, we gave your department an entire dossier, and now you're telling us that it's our fault when you didn't react to it. And so you see the internal squabbling inside the ruling party because they're so embarrassed about it. And then you see all of them saying we couldn't react quickly enough. And of course, the ultimate shame of moving on to the list of failing states. Cyril Ramaphosa has said very often that he doesn't want South Africa to be a failed state. But if you look at the extent of the failure around warning of the insurrection, dealing with the inciters, and then responding when the wave of looting and mayhem hit KwaZulu-Natal and parts of Gauteng, that is around Johannesburg, it showed that the state was completely unready to deal with this. And the extent to which the failure of the state was shown up was in the private sector, very broadly defined, that swung in and protected whole communities. It was neighborhood watches, it was community organizations, it was community police forums, it was residents associations, it was private security companies. They all took hands where the police was just virtually absent and protected whole neighborhoods. Unfortunately, quite a number of people died, not at the hands of most local community watchers. They set up roadblocks and they protected particular neighborhoods. But in Phoenix, which is an Indian area, about 20 plus people were actually killed by people protecting their neighborhood, which has resulted in huge tensions between Zulu speakers and Indian South Africans, and a lot of racial polarization around that, which is a very, very serious consequence. So I think what it showed was state failure and the private sector success. I mean, some of those shops were restocked within the week, and huge convoys, kilometers long, of retailers trucking stock to KwaZulu-Natal to restock the shops, showed how extraordinary the South African private sector is and what it can achieve. And the distinction between the failed state and the mobilized civil society and commercial private sector was a comparison that really struck home.
Mm.
And so the shaming of the South African state, I think, is a good characterization.
I was interested in one thing you were saying earlier, which is the idea of basically seizing political power. For those who don't know, there's a party called the Economic Freedom Fighters, who run on sort of mandate very similar perhaps to ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. And it would seem to me from what you're saying that that's a real possibility, that there's a swathe of South African politics that could go in that direction.
There is, but I think this particular set of riots, I don't want to call it an insurrection because I don't believe it was. It was definitely sparked by Jacob Zuma's imprisonment. But this tends us in a different direction. The Economic Freedom Fighters have done very, very badly in this crisis, this COVID crisis, because they have not been able to rely on their normal mobilization, mass mobilization, and huge events, because they were banned, obviously, under lockdown as super spreader events. And Parliament has been conducted virtually, so they haven't been able to do all of their antics in Parliament. And so they haven't had the stage on which they usually perform to mobilize their supporters. So that has reflected very badly on them in the polls. I think the big battle in KwaZulu-Natal was a different one. I think it is a reflection of the unraveling of the African National Congress. And it is the radical economic transformation wing of the ANC versus the Cyril Ramaphosa wing. And when Jacob Zuma went to prison, the radical economics transformation wing started mobilizing against the Ramaphosa wing. And that is where the battle is. It's inside the ANC, primarily. And of course, when the ANC sneezes, South Africa gets pneumonia. And that's what's happened there. But I think that it's a very important development, because in the end, civil society and business asserted itself. Order was eventually restored. Communities protected themselves. And above all, and very, very tellingly, the shops were restocked, the place was reconstructed, and within a week, in most places, except those places that had been burnt to the ground, in most places, it was back to business as usual. And many, many people came and gave back looted goods, but it's obviously very difficult to restock shops with looted goods. So all in all, it shows how resilient the South African society is in all of this. We're extraordinarily resilient, and sometimes we wish we had other adjectives that describe us. But one thing we do is get up after these kinds of crises and get on with life.
Yeah. I want to talk to you a bit about the Democratic Alliance, the main opposition party. You've been in opposition, all this time, essentially since your formation, and even now in the last elections, I think the ANC got 59% of the vote. It seems to me that it doesn't seem to, you don't seem to have made much inroads. More than the majority of people consistently vote for the ANC. Why haven't you gained any traction?
Well, first of all, we have gained a lot of traction. We started in 1994 when South Africa became a democracy. We got 1.7% of the vote. Now we are over 20% of the vote, which is a very good place to be.
It's less than 1% a year, though, isn't it? Substantially.
Well, let me just say this, that in our system is a proportional representation system. It's not a constituency system as you have in Britain. It's a proportional representation system as you have in Europe. And there, parties are damn happy if they get in the 20%, because proportional representation systems lend themselves to coalitions. They are not first past the post and winner-take-all systems, as the British system is. And people must understand that the minute you have a proportional system, you have very, very different electoral outcomes. When you have first past the post, you have a winner and a loser in each constituency, and you have a winner and a loser in Parliament. But here we have a whole range of parties, and I think in this election coming up, the ANC will fall below 50% in many, many local authorities. And not only did we grow very substantially, but we are the government in the Western Cape, and we are the government in 30 local authorities around the country. And that is extraordinary progress from a tiny opposition party. But the truth is that in a country like ours, which is very difficult for most people internationally to comprehend, we're a very unlikely country. We are the legacy of colonialism and imperialism, all put together in a country that ordinarily wouldn't belong together. The country is almost the sizes of large swaths of Europe, which are all different countries divided into, and we have 11 ethnic groups that are in many instances as different as the French are from the Greeks. But we're all in this unitary state, and the ANC has done a lot to overcome tribalism and ethnic divisions amongst Black people, but the mobilization amongst Black people to run the country has been very, very profound. And although we've got many Black leaders in the DA and more Black voters than white voters, the race card is still played with significant effect. It is a huge divider, and that's going to take time to overcome. I mean,
why doesn't the party have a significant Black leadership? I mean, you're the leader of the party is white. You're the chair of the council. I mean, this is an obvious thing to say. With Black leadership, you might attract more votes.
Well, we had Black leadership before, and we've had several Black leaders. We recently had 8 out of 9 Black provincial leaders. So provinces are very important in the South African setup, and we had a Black leader. What we learned in the course of that process is that having a good leader is more important than the color of the leader.
I think you're in part referring to Mamusi Mamani, who was the leader until 2019, and he's created a separate party. What were the reasons for his departure? What were the differences between you and him?
Well, I didn't have any differences with him. He appointed a commission to look into why we went backwards in the 2019 election. And the commission that he appointed concluded that it was his weak leadership and vacillating leadership that had resulted in the reversal and the deep divisions within the party and the lack of direction in the party. So he really had no option but to step down after the commission found that he had failed as a leader.
Do you see a potential for the ANC to split? And would that offer opportunities perhaps for the DA?
Well, the ANC split often. It started splitting in the 1990s when Bantu Holomisa left. Those splits just continued in dribs and drabs. Eventually, a big split happened when Cope moved away under the former chair of the ANC, Monsieur Lakota, otherwise known as Terra Lakota. And then there was the other big split when Julius Malema left as the ANC Youth League leader when he was suspended to form the Economic Freedom Fighters. I think it was in 2013. So there have been numerous splits, and that will continue. That process will continue. Everybody's holding out to control the brand of the ANC, the organization, the name. There's hardly any functional organization to speak of. The organization is held together by patronage networks. But there's no doubt that this is going to be pretty much a fight to the death, and there's going to be a lot of internal jockeying. I think what we're seeing is the ANC coming apart and unraveling. What happened in KwaZulu-Natal a couple of weeks ago was a mass unraveling of the ANC. And that is going to have enormous impacts down the road. I think we could see the ANC fall under 50% in the 2024 election.
Right. Helen, thank you so much for your contribution so far. I just want to get a couple of thoughts from Peter Sullivan, who's been here and listening in. But Peter, your thoughts or any questions? And then after that, I'm going to start bringing in people from questions listening in, and Paul Jackson will be first up. So if we can bring up Paul Jackson in a second, we can turn to his question. But go ahead, Peter, your thoughts.
Well, I mean, as we talked before Helen managed to join us, I do think there was a bit of an insurrection, so I disagree slightly with her on that. But as for the rest, I mean, Helen and I agree on all the basics. I'd be very interested in knowing, Helen, what you think the DA will be facing in 2024. I mean, do you think there will be a big hive off of the Ace Magashule faction? Do you think they will get together with the EFF?
Well, my reckoning is that the Ace Magashule faction wants to hang in there.
Can you just explain for those of us who are going to be listening and who are going to be less sure of who these names are, just give us some background on who they are and what they represent.
Right. Cyril Ramaphosa is, of course, the president of the ANC and the president of South Africa. Ace Magashule is the secretary general of the ANC, very powerful position, a position that holds the organizational strings in his hand. That's roughly what I am in the Democratic Alliance. That's my job in the Democratic Alliance. Now, Ace Magashule was very close to Jacob Zuma and very close to the people who captured Jacob Zuma, who captured the state, namely the Gupta brothers, if people know that. So their argument basically is that whites are responsible for the problems in South Africa, and that white monopoly capital, which is an invention of theirs, has to be eradicated, and that only the state under their control can do that through radical economic transformation. That is their argument. And Cyril Ramaphosa, on the other hand, and his group disagrees with that and is trying to stand by the principle of constitutionalism and non-racialism. And so there's a very, very deep divide in the ANC between those two factions. And currently, the Ace Magashule Radical Economic Transformation faction is on the back foot. They're on the back foot because Ace Magashule, the Secretary General, was suspended from the party. And he appealed against that suspension and was turned down, and now he wants to appeal against that as well. So the Radical Economic Transformation faction with Jacob Zuma in jail, who was their main champion, and Ace Magashule, the former Secretary General, are on the back foot. But I think their strategy is to hang in there to prevent themselves being kicked out of the party long enough to get through what should be the 2021 election, now probably the 2022 election, if the Constitutional Court agrees to that. They want the ANC to do really badly in that election so that when Cyril Ramaphosa goes back significantly from the 59% previously achieved, when they fall under 50%, or in many, many towns and cities, because this is a local government election, not a national election that's happening. When they fall under 50%, they're going to use that to call a special General Congress and vote Ramaphosa out, propose a motion of no confidence. I think that is their strategy. But to do that, they've got to hang in the party for a long time. They thought it was till October the 27th, which is when the election should have been. Now there's a likelihood that it will be postponed if the Constitutional Court says it should be. Our party is very opposed to having the Constitutional Court tinker with the timeframes that the Constitution has established for elections. We really believe that this election is going to be postponed because it doesn't suit the ANC, because it's internal conflict, that it's going to be postponed because the ANC doesn't want it to be held now, which is a terrible, terrible precedent to enable a ruling party to choose a timing that it best suits it for holding an election. And so we're going to oppose it very strongly. But if they manage to get the election postponed, and if they manage to expel most of the leaders of the Radical Economic Transformation grouping, they will then have to organize from outside the party. And I still think that they will do the party quite a lot of damage. And I still think the party will fall under 50% in many places, but the Radical Economic Transformation will be no longer inside the party to drive the motion of no confidence against Cyril. So that is why they're trying to get them out before the election.
Okay, I just want to recap on some of the things that have been levelled against the ANC over the last 10 years in Zuma's time in government. Unemployment increasing from 5.4 to 9.2 million. The overall things like capital investment falling away. The Gini index puts South Africa as now one of the most unequal countries in the world, according to the World Bank. I mean, do you Helen, would you all put that at Zuma's feet? Or is this something that precedes that for some time?
Well, during the Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki era, South Africa achieved 5 to 6% growth. We were budgeting for a surplus. The number of jobs almost doubled. And whatever you say about Thabo Mbeki's presidency, he knew how to make an economy grow, and he knew how to attract investment and growth. Obviously, that didn't resolve all of our problems, but it gave a good tax dividend that enabled us to become the only welfare state in Africa, properly defined. The big problem was that during Mandela's term already, and then very much strengthened by Thabo Mbeki, they introduced a policy of what they called cadre deployment, which was basically a system of organized patronage or cronyism. And people who were owed political favors were deployed to all institutions of the state that should have been independent of party politics, given the principle of separation of powers, and should have been selected on merit to be able to run the various utilities, such as the electricity utility, the National Prosecuting Authority, the Reserve Bank, the Chapter 9 institutions like the Public Protector and all of those things. And they were slowly captured by the dominant faction in the ANC. Starting under Mandela, that policy was adopted, hastening under Thabo Mbeki, but very much disguised by a growing economy. But when Zuma took over the reins as a kind of patrimonial traditionalist, he then really started capturing those institutions, putting loyalists of his into all of these strategic positions and using them as vehicles for looting. And so the result was that Eskom, a utility that used to be the most productive electricity utility in the world, in terms of electricity generated per unit price, fell into complete disrepair, and now load shedding, as we call it, or blackouts, are relatively regular features of life in South Africa. Many of those institutions have really become shells. They have all the outer appearance of the institutions, none of the internal substance of what makes for viable institutions. And all of that is the result of the centralization of power in the party capturing the state trying to control society, and the ANC deploying its loyalists everywhere to obliterate the distinction between party and state. And on that basis, using the state as a license to loot, and therefore destroying the economy. In a recent major survey of international investors in South Africa, where they were asked to identify the major barriers to investment, number one was the electricity uncertainty. Number two was broad-based Black economic empowerment, which has nothing to do with broad-based Black economic empowerment. It is a fig leaf to disguise the manipulation by the ruling oligarchs of their determination to win the tenders, to win the contracts, to get all of the state, to tap into every capital flow in the country under the guise of being Black and therefore promoting equity. It does absolutely nothing of the sort. It destroys competition. It makes poor people poorer. It drives the cost of goods up. It makes some people obscenely wealthy because of their party connections, and it makes others miserably poor. And in the meantime, the role that the state should be playing to provide proper electricity, clean water, sewage systems, functional public education, proper hospitals, all go down the tubes.
You wrote quite a sympathetic entry, I think, on your Facebook page when Jacob Zuma was initially imprisoned, and that struck me quite a bit. Can you say why you did that?
Well, when I was leader of the opposition, I was on Jacob Zuma's extended cabinet, and I got to know Zuma very well. And I must say that I got on very well with him. You know, Hannah Arendt used to talk about the banality of evil. I developed another analysis of Jacob Zuma. He really has no idea what constitutionalism is about. He's a patriarchal, patrimonial traditionalist who understands the chieftaincy system, which is as far away from a modern constitutional democracy as the Magna Carta is from modern Britain. And it's not for nothing that it took 800 years to get from there to where you are today in Britain. So I don't think that we should in any way underestimate the lack of alignment between the values and the political context of a patrimonial leader with a constitutional democracy. He often used to say to me, Helen, why can the judges tell me what to do? I was elected, they weren't. He really had a fundamentally different understanding of what corruption was. In the chieftaincy system, no one is born with inherent rights that no one can take away from you, as we have constitutionally in the Bill of Rights. Whatever you get is a favor from the chief. And if you displease the chief, he can take it away from you. And to win the approval of the chief, you give him gifts and you're very subordinate, and accountability works from the bottom up. In democracy, accountability works from the top down. And there are all kinds of checks and balances in the arrangement of a constitutional democracy between the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, the separation of party and state, different spheres of government, etc. And without being patronizing or condescending, from my own personal experience of having regular discussions with Jacob Zuma, he understood none of that. He understood none of that. And he sometimes said to me, you know, I did nothing wrong with the Guptas. I was promoting BBBEE, broad-based Black economic empowerment. That's what he genuinely believed. Now, he might have been putting on a good show, but I really think that he was a traditionalist caught up in a modern constitutional democracy. I mean, Francis Fukuyama was here and analyzed the whole situation. He said quite tellingly that South Africa's constitution was a bit like a growth that had been put on a human patient. I mean, there is a very weak alignment. Now, I'm not saying for 1 minute, before people misunderstand me, that all Black people are like Jacob. I'm not a racist. I don't generalize about groups of people. Here I'm talking about one individual who happened to be the president, who was Jacob Zuma. And while he must have read in the newspapers and seen that things were wrong, he genuinely viewed women in a way that is totally incompatible with our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. He once said he was very pleased when women came crawling to him on their bellies to show respect. You know, he has multiple wives and multiple children by other people. He's a traditionalist. And not all Black people obviously are traditionalists. Many Black people are highly educated, highly versed with constitutionalism, but Jacob Zuma wasn't.
Yeah.
And that was an incredibly bad alignment between the president, who saw himself as an elected paramount chief, and the Constitution that he was called on to defend. And he didn't know how to. He didn't have the analytical tools. He didn't have the personal tools. He just didn't know how to do it.
Okay.
And one day when we were asking questions in Parliament about Nkandla, where he spent 160 million rand on upgrading his own personal house with public money, when we wanted to ask some questions in Parliament and went down to see for ourselves because we weren't getting any answers, his house looked like a golf estate spreading over 2 or 3 hills in KwaZulu-Natal, one of the poorest areas. And as we walked towards it, literally hundreds of poverty-stricken people came out of their huts and shacks to block our way because they didn't see it as us demanding accountability from somebody who'd abused public money, including obviously their money. They saw it as, how dare we come and try to challenge their chief. And so people mustn't underestimate it. And it's not being patronizing or condescending. I have lived this. I know what it is like.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that summary. I do recall our visit to Nkandla with Peter Sullivan a few years back, where his security officials didn't like us turning up at his gates, and I think we're all quite fortunate to drive away without even a fine. Let's get some questions in now. We've got a short bit of time left for questions. Let's try and make these questions fairly short. I'd like to come to Andy Mendes first of all, and then I want to take Paul Davis, who's a well-known South African figure and a doctor who may have a different perspective on things. Andy, go ahead, please. Andy Mendes.
Hello, Peter, first of all. Yeah, quick question, but perhaps a big one. You've talked a lot about political realignment and changing, quite slow changing in political, within political parties. You've not talked at all about the integrity of the state. And we did talk earlier about Scotland and England breaking up. Is there any likelihood or possibility, let's say, of Western Cape or KwaZulu-Natal or even Gauteng becoming or bidding for independence and breaking up RSA?
Okay. Let's try and deal with these questions fairly quick fire, so we get through quite a few questions. So Helen and Peter, very briefly on that, possibility of regional factionalism, people pushing away for their own regions.
I think it's much more likely now than it was 2 or 3 years ago. And if you ask me to put money on it, I would not bet that in 20 years South Africa will still be a unitary state. There's a huge push in the Western Cape for autonomy, and some are pushing very hard for independence. And I think the same is very likely to emerge in KwaZulu-Natal now.
I'm shocked by that. Peter, do you agree with that?
I think the Western Cape will become independent when Scotland becomes independent.
Well, Scotland might become independent within the next 5 years.
But might not.
But as likely, because Scotland may have a referendum on that very soon. I can't see the Western Cape having one very shortly.
Well, we're pushing legislation in Parliament. We're pushing legislation in Parliament to allow a Western Cape referendum. However, the DA, my party, does not support the Western Cape becoming independent. We support federalism and a very significant devolution of power, which currently is not happening.
Okay, and you were the Premier of the Western Cape, we should add there.
Yes.
Right, okay, let's bring in Paul Jackson. Go ahead, Paul. Quick, Paul. Okay, Paul not there. Go ahead, Paul. Go on.
Paul is there.
Go on, Paul.
Come off mute, Paul.
Paul Jackson or Paul Davis?
Well, Paul Jackson hasn't got his act together, so let's have Paul Davis. Go ahead, Paul Davis.
Okay, I just wondered what Helen thought about how does one unravel this whole problem of cadre employment across the whole of the private sector, because these people are employed and they are subject to different rules. I mean, the cadre deployment has been a disaster.
Let's just, Peter Sullivan, just explain what cadres are, just so people understand who may not be familiar with this system.
A cadre, Comrade Nicholas, is if you have done really good work for the party, we reward you and we ask you, where would you like to go? I mean, do you know anything about electricity? And if you say no, then we send you to Eskom. Do you know anything about transport? And if you say no, we'll put you in charge of the ports. So cadre deployment is taking somebody who has been politically active within the ANC and giving them a nice lucrative plum job, despite the fact that they have absolutely no idea of how to do it.
Okay, and this is degraded. I'm just going to give you a little anecdote. So if I want to take a letter to the postal service in South Africa, I could go to the post office. The chance of it getting processed professionally is fairly limited, whereas it might 2 decades ago or longer it might have worked. Is that a fair example, Helen? And does that explain part of the problem?
It actually would have worked. Now nobody uses the post office anymore. Our postal service was excellent. It was a really reliable postal service. It isn't anymore at all. And now the post office is trying to fight back by banning courier companies from transporting small packages, and everybody's fighting back against that. So you completely make a state entity like the post office fail, and then you ban the private sector from getting into your space because you lose all your custom. That's how it works.
Answer Paul's question, Helen.
I'll answer Paul's question about cadre deployment. Look, it's going to be very, very difficult. First, we have to get it declared unconstitutional, and we're going to be working towards that. And then we're going to have to unravel the entire state. It takes a long time. I took over with Cape Town as mayor from the ANC, and I took over the Western Cape government from the ANC, and both were full of deployed cadres at the time. And I said to people, if you're prepared to be professional public servants, and if you're prepared to fall under our monitoring and evaluation systems, and if you're prepared to deliver on the goods, your jobs will be safe. Otherwise, you are out. And we worked quite a number of people out. I could do that by looking at their contracts. Usually, if you look at the process through which they were put into those positions, you will find something that is unlawful, procedurally wrong, or you can work people out on the basis of performance. It takes a very long time. It's very hard to do that. But I was able to do it in a number of occasions. And eventually, after a first term, I could build a capable state. And after a second term, I could actually deliver some stuff on the basis of the capable state. But it is very difficult. And the longer the ANC has been in office, the harder it is to turn it around.
And it's not just about people, it's also about investment, isn't it? So whilst so Eskom is something you spoke about earlier, but the failure to invest in state-owned enterprises.
Well, the failure to do that, I mean, it's all about enrichment. So when they started Kusile and Medupi, which are 2 huge coal-fired power plants, they had also set up something called Chancellor House. And this was a multi-billion rand investment. And all of the companies from overseas and locally that got tenders, multi-million and often multi-billion rand tenders for those 2 huge power plants, could only get them if they paid a handsome donation to the ANC through Chancellor House, which you might remember Hitachi, there was a huge controversy over Hitachi, which did that. They got a huge tender from the ANC, and then Hitachi had to, in fact, pay over a huge amount to the ANC in return for that tender. And I tried to make a huge international deal of that, but that's how the ANC used to fundraise. It was pure, open, institutionalized corruption.
Okay.
Nicholas, can I ask Helen whether she's optimistic about the future?
Please, you know me. I'm always optimistic because I really do believe that there are enough South Africans working together. I mean, I've just come back from Pretoria now, about an hour ago, where I met a whole range of civil society organizations. And what we have understood, and this is why I'm optimistic, that we have to become immune to state failure. The only way to make South Africa work is for ordinary people, as we saw in KwaZulu-Natal, and as we're seeing with electricity, with water, with roads, with public transport, with everything, to become immune from a failed state. And for that reason, and because it's happening, even if it can't happen de jure, it is happening de facto. Because if the state stops producing energy, the private sector is going to get in and produce energy. Now we've got more than...
Helen, that does sound pretty naive to me. I mean, when you're talking about those kind of huge investments for that kind of infrastructure, generators are not going to replace power stations. Local clinics are not going to provide medical services for the country. Overall, job creation, yes, you could say if the economy, the private sector is allowed to thrive, it might provide more jobs, but it's not going to replace a state.
Nicholas, a capable state is absolutely essential. But let me tell you, when there's a failing state, nature abhors a vacuum. Now let's just look at private healthcare. Currently, there are products coming onto the market that for 129 Rand a month, divide that by 21 and you'll get the number of pounds, you can have a significant access to private doctors for that amount a month as medical aid. That's the level at which some of these medical aids are now coming in on, because the clinics are falling apart, so there's a market there. There's a partnership between a growing partnership between private corporations and a private school group of entrepreneurs called Curo. The owners of the land write down the value of their land. Curo builds a school, and they can give you private world-class education for 800 Rand a month. Divide that by 20, and you'll get it what it is in pounds. It's amazing where the private sector is going. It is absolutely amazing where the private sector is going. In the Western Cape, we have lopped off an entire stage of load shedding through 3,000, not generators, small-scale embedded generation that was previously up to 1 megawatt, then up to 10 megawatts, now it's up to 100 megawatts. And then you're really talking serious electricity generation. And when these corporations have vast roofs and they cover it with solar panels, they can't use all of that electricity. So they wheel it and they pump it into the grid and sell it to other entities. We've got 3,000 people doing that. And it means that we are a whole load shedding state above other provinces. Okay. And with 100 megawatts, you watch the private sector move into that space and do it.
I'm always impressed by this roller coaster of optimism and pessimism in South Africa, and it does give one sort of an idea of reassurance or some reassurance. But I can't help feeling that the roller coaster is keeping on going downhill. Diane Cook in a second, but Paul Jackson, you've got a question. 2 last questions to go. Go ahead, Paul. Paul, not there? Okay, Diane Cook. Go ahead, Diane.
I thought as you were talking about the cadre system, it sounded like the former Soviet Union. And I guess my question is, and I think Helen was more optimistic, but will RSA go the way of the USSR and implode?
Look, it's not impossible. I don't think it'll do that in the foreseeable future, but it isn't impossible. I don't think South Africa will necessarily be a unitary state anymore in 20 years' time. But, in the meantime, you might think it's naive, Nicholas, but believe me, when a state fails and there are capable people in civil society and the private sector, they move very, very quickly to fill the vacuum. And the extent to which people are now organizing to become immune to a failing state is amazing. In safety, in education, in electricity generation, in water purification, in everything. In many towns in rural areas, private citizens organizing together have taken over the sewage works, have taken over the water purification systems, have taken over a whole range of functions, filling potholes, cutting verges. They're doing it. Now, obviously, they can't do everything, but we've got this behemoth of a state. You know, Thomas Hobbes would have written another Leviathan if he saw our state that can't do anything. And so private citizens are forming organizations of huge social cohesion and getting it done. I've just been talking about it in Pretoria today and talking with organizations that are actually doing it.
Okay, Helen, thank you so much indeed. There we have to end it then. If you are able to stay on for a few minutes afterwards, we've got a
I'll
few...
definitely stay on because I couldn't get on in the beginning. So I'm definitely going to stay on for at least as long as you can.
Well, let's stay with this then. Let's hold off because normally we would have a break at this point, but let's stay with you then. Peter, you're just tell me your reaction to what Helen was saying. I mean, I'm not really swayed by the idea that individual citizens can step in entirely for the state. You need roads built, you need infrastructure, you know, you need regulation, you need good lawmaking, and there's a whole range of things you can't look to the individual for. Peter, what's your assessment?
Well, there's a lot of hijacking in this country, you know. So I want to hijack Paul Davis now. He has been party to people trying to create a place where you can go to find out whether the rumors that we hear are true or not true. Paul, do you want to talk about that?
You catch me on my left foot, but it is part of what Helen is saying, is that you have to become immune to the failing state. And there's no doubt that the intelligence that preceded the insurrection or riots or whatever you want to call them was entirely absent, as was their preparedness. And there's a big move now between the private sector, community organizations, COSATU, big business, and the SACC, the South African Council of Churches, to put together an integrated awareness, situational awareness and response activation system in order to supplement what you said before was the people's response to criminal or riot or large mass actions that may take place in the country in the future.
So really, Nicholas, that's supporting what Helen's saying. So even in the field of intelligence and to some extent of reporting, the private sector are moving into where the government should be doing that stuff. So yes, I do agree with Helen. I think people are going to move into those vacuums, and people are going to have to get used to, as they have been, dealing with a failed state. As the state starts to fail in education, in medical health, in roads, the private sector moves in. I hadn't quite thought of it in that way, but I mean, I think Helen puts it well.
And that's exactly what's happening. Let me just even take the prosecution authority. The prosecution authority was fully captured by Jacob Zuma and was only used to score political points against his enemies. Cyril Ramaphosa is trying to fix it, but to try and fix a failed state institution is very, very difficult. And we are yet to see the fruits of this because they keep on holding commissions of inquiry which can't prosecute and find people guilty and get them jailed. They can't do any of that. That's for the courts and the police. So in many ways, these commissions act as diversions outside the criminal justice system. Now, an organization, a civil society organization, has started a private prosecution service where if you've got a problem and if you've got a criminal case that you want to lay against someone, you go to them. And they make a private prosecution of it, completely bypassing the police and the National Prosecuting Authority. And they go to court for you.
Yeah, but it doesn't go, you don't have to go too far to say that if you don't have independent judges, you know, a whole range of things, that what the individual can do is going to be, you've got to have a framework in which to operate. Yeah. So I'm arguing with myself here. Paul Jackson's question is, he's been unable to open his microphone properly, is do the different tribal loyalties, that's 11 different ethnic groups at least, which are so strong, mean that the real democracy can never exist in South Africa? Helen?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. Real democracy can only exist when the government can change hands through the ballot box. Now, people in the Western Cape who voted for the Democratic Alliance in large numbers in 2006 when I became the mayor We didn't get an overall majority, we got 42%. But we were able to put together a 7-party coalition to pull us over the 50% mark. And since then, people in the Western Cape have given us larger and larger majorities and voted against the ANC more and more. And they have seen with absolute dismay that to a large extent that pattern has not been followed in the rest of the country. And they argue that because we're a demographic democracy, not an issue-based democracy, we're never going to get to the point where we can get a change of government at national level. Now, I don't believe that is true, because we broke out beautifully out of the Western Cape in 2016 when we managed to put together a coalition in Port Elizabeth, which is now called Nelson Mandela Bay. And we were able to put a coalition together, but a very, very ill-advised one in both Tshwane, which is Pretoria, and Johannesburg. Now, those coalitions didn't work because we comprised too many incompatible parties. But nevertheless, the frustration with the slow pace of moving towards a consolidated democracy where power can change hands through the ballot box has left many people extremely disillusioned, and that is the impetus behind moves for Cape secession. They say this is nonsense. We don't want to be ruled by these corrupt people. Their voters never vote them out, and we want an independent state. And in KwaZulu-Natal, you've got the move of saying, we're Zulus. There are no Zulus anymore in the cabinet. Cyril Ramaphosa is getting rid of Zweli Mkhize, who was found to have been corrupt as health minister. He might have to get rid of Becky Cele over the failed policing issue and a whole range of corruption scandals there, and the admission by the police commissioner that they are no longer able to provide policing functions. And the Zulus are arguing, well, you know, we were on top with Zuma, and now you're kicking us around like this. So that's given a huge upwelling to ethnic nationalism in KwaZulu-Natal. So yes, these are factors. These are very real factors, most real in KwaZulu-Natal and the Western Cape. But we will see how far they develop in the years ahead.
One question we haven't asked, which is fairly obvious, is to what extent has COVID influenced this political atmosphere? What has been the impact of COVID on ordinary South Africans, or poor South Africans, I should say, Helen?
Dramatic. I mean, you know, we've now got 43% unemployment. 43% unemployment. Now, remember, I don't know if they counted the right number of people or whether they did, but under F.W. de Klerk, unemployment was 10% and considered to be a national crisis. And now it's 42%. And it's up from 30% to 42% because of COVID. Now, the national despair, the hunger, the poverty, the lack of tax revenue, and the need to keep people fed is a huge, huge challenge. And the government is now trying to push a basic income grant for everybody. And that is going to cost billions, and we won't be able to fund it from taxation because the middle class has been so massively squeezed in South Africa, which is where the majority of taxes come from. So we're going to have to fund it through borrowing. And already our borrowing is at a ridiculously high level. So it's a very, very serious situation. COVID could not have come at a worse time, and it could not have had a worse impact. And I do think that the deprivation, the hunger, the marginalization as a result of unemployment arising out of COVID and the lockdowns was very significant as a factor in the uprising in KwaZulu-Natal.
If there is, I mean, you talk about the high tax burden. I mean, where does South Africa's economy is, minerals based, or has been for a long time, and obviously there's been a downturn in commodities now. So where does growth come from?
Well, that's the point. Mining has been declared uninvestable in South Africa because of the fact that the new law, the Minerals, Petroleum and Something Resources Amendment Act, what it's called, basically requires a very significant BBBEE, Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Stake, even for prospecting. And it basically says also that you must always have a specific level of Black shareholding. It's not a question of once empowered, always empowered. And so, which means Black people find it difficult to sell their shares. And if they sell their shares, they can only sell it to other Black people to keep the proportion the same. Now, this is like cadre deployment in investing. It's basically huge investments for the politically connected and a very rapid route to riches. There was a scandal around the Speaker of Parliament, the ANC Speaker of Parliament, for example, getting paid a bribe of 25 million when she was chair of the ANC to give Goldfields a license to operate. So that's how empowerment works in the mining sector. And it's got to the point that there's no more investment in mining. And that is our key sector that has driven our economy and grown our economy. John Froneman is the one stayer in all of this, and probably Mark Kutifani of AngloGold, but they've all moved abroad with their headquarters. And except for Neil Froneman, he's sticking it out here and working very hard, but he's extremely critical of government. Now, there has been a mini commodities boom, which has pushed up the tax revenue somewhat, but that'll all be squandered immediately on operational expenditure and other things. So, this is the problem. In trying to enrich a tiny elite, they make the Gini coefficient more and more extreme, and they institutionalize corruption, and they enrich a small elite and drive skilled people out of the country. It's a perfect storm.
We've got time just for two more questions now. I'm going to get a comment or question from Lois Tart, who's in Sydney, Australia. Go ahead, Lois.
Yes, I'm actually coming out in support of some of Helen's comments, particularly about how you were saying that the community or people can overcome where the state is failing with regard to power generation. We're actually seeing that in Australia with a lot of solar power being put in at the household level, business level, etc., to the point now where the system is being overloaded because there's so much power being generated through solar power. So the idea that the government's a sole distributor of certain things like power is actually being completely disrupted by new forms of technology and people's willingness to adapt to it. So it's very much when you're looking at these things like, oh no, the state can only do that. It's proven wrong in these cases. So it's very much wide open. Where the state fails, people will find a way around it. Humans are an ingenious species. That's how we got to be the top creatures on this planet.
I wonder if that happened in terms that applies to the sort of the balance of power between different parts of government, the executive and justice and principle, things like that, affecting the rule of law. That's really part of the question too. Let's bring in a question from Stephen Redfern.
Hello. I'm surprised not to hear any mention of China in a discussion of South Africa. Is Chinese investment having any significance in South African politics as it is in the rest of Africa, I understand?
Thanks, Stephen.
Pete, do you want to take that?
No, I have no idea.
Well, we have got a reasonable amount of Chinese investment. And when the Chinese invest, they do often believe that they can start dictating the political terms. So when I was Premier, the Chinese Consul General came to see me and said, there's a Taiwanese flag flying in the waterfront and he needs me to take it down. So I said I would go and look. I was puzzled by this, but it was outside a private restaurant. So I went back to him and I said, that's a private enterprise. We can't interfere there. I mean, if he wants to fly any flag outside his business that he wants to, he's entitled to do that. We try and live by constitutionalism and free speech. And he was outraged. He said, if you do this, you can't expect investment from China. And I said, listen, we're a free country. And when you're here, you have to really understand that the state can't interfere in the flags that restaurateurs, private restaurateurs, put outside their restaurants. So it becomes tricky in those kinds of situations, it really does. But China has got nothing on FIFA. When we ran the World Cup, they wanted us to shorten our national anthem to fit in between the advertising slots on the advertising of that day. And I said, are you out of your mind? We are. We've got a national anthem and every word is important for us. And we will sing it from beginning to end. So please change the advertising slots on your broadcasting.
But Japan succeeded for the Olympics. We have a shorter anthem.
Oh, really? Okay. Okay.
Nicholas, the one thing I'm sorry that we've missed is that Helen wrote such a moving tribute to Zuma, and you asked her about it, and she got derailed by her own rhetoric about Zuma. And I wish you would just say one or two things about why he is such a nice man.
Yeah. So Helen, talk about, because you had a low point, and there was a phone call when he rang you. You were having a tough time, and he gave you a sympathetic message.
You know, I've got into huge trouble for writing that piece, and not for the reasons that you would think, because I wrote a sympathetic piece about Zuma. I got a bollocking from all the politically correct woke folk around for saying that he was a traditionalist, and them claiming that saying that, which is an obvious fact, was racist. Of course, what else? So I couldn't give a damn about that. Look, Zuma is a warm human being. And he genuinely shows that warmth. And, you know, I was the only member of his extended cabinet who wasn't from his party. There were the 9 premiers, 8 of them were ANC. I was the only one who wasn't. There was the full cabinet, which is a vast array of people, and their directors general. And I would be the only opposition voice in the room. And on the very first occasion of the President's Coordinating Council, which is the extended cabinet meeting, it was just after we'd had a very bruising election campaign, and I'd just won by the skin of our teeth with 51 point something % in the Western Cape. We got an overall majority in 2009. And it had been, I mean, our election slogan had been Stop Zuma. And the day before the President's Coordinating Council, he phoned me, he took the trouble to phone me and said, look, you're coming up to Pretoria tomorrow. You'll be the only non-ANC person in the room. I just want to reassure you that you'll be warmly welcomed. There won't be any hostility towards you. Now, he's a brand new elected president. He must have had a million things on his mind. And there he was phoning me up and saying, I'd like you to put yourself at ease. When my own party was going against me and had drunk the woke Kool-Aid and were coming after me with everything they had for just telling a few home truths, as I have done today. And when they suspended me and did all kinds of things to me, it was Zuma who called me and said, you must be going through a terribly hard time. I just wanted to tell you that I'm thinking of you and you must be strong and have courage. Now, you don't do that. You know, there was nothing he could gain from that. It couldn't have been a manipulation. He genuinely meant it. When we used to go to his very smart residence in Pretoria after these big cabinet shindigs, there was also always a nice meal, and then there was music. And on my very first time there, he tapped me on my shoulder and asked me to dance. Now, you know, I'm a terrible dancer. I've never learned to dance. I don't know what I'm doing. And he said, don't worry, just follow me. I'll teach you how to dance. And that night he spent the entire evening teaching me to foxtrot and things. And he knew it like the back of his hand. And he was genuinely warm. When I used to come home and tell my husband about this, my husband said, are you sure he doesn't want you as a new wife? I said to my husband, no. I'm twice the age and half the size he likes. So it's not going to work out. You can't get rid of me this easily.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think that's a very happy note to leave on. And I think it's been a really enriching sort of hour and 20 minutes. We've heard about all aspects of South African politics. It's been a very good overview of what's been happening over the last few weeks, and also a more sort of complex and nuanced view of the political future. So Helen Zille, thank you very much indeed for your time, and also my thanks to Peter Sullivan. It's been a really good hour and a bit.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been great being with you.